Panic and terror gripped the galaxy. An engineered Doomsday virus posed an imminent threat to life across the stars. On the bustling Zeta station, a human xenobiologist named George Robertson pushed through crowds of aliens conducting business. His face looked worried as he barged into the extravagant office of the high-ranking Benzite alien named Speaker. Speaker had a brightly colored bird-like crest and a scaly green face. Speaker looked up in annoyance at the interruption. George slammed a datapad on Speaker's desk. "We have a problem. A huge fucking problem." George pointed at a spinning complex molecular diagram that looked like a spiky ball of death. Speaker read the data, his annoyance shifting to horror. "By the ancestors, what monstrosity is this?" "A bioengineered virus. It targets genetic markers in 90% of known sapient life. If released, trillions die." George's voice sounded urgent. Speaker's reptilian eyes widened. "Where did you find this abomination?" "I will contact station security and the Galactic Council immediately. But we require more information. Who designed this weapon, and how can it be neutralized?" George replied, his tone hardening. "I plan to find out, and I have a lead." He quickly strode out of the office, knowing the very fate of life in the galaxy now hinged on his actions. Somehow, some way, he needed to stop the coming viral apocalypse. Failure meant extinction. George pushed his way through the bustling promenade, ignoring the bewildering array of alien sights, sounds, and smells around him. Keeping his head low, he ducked down a dimly lit side passage, the gaudy signs and well-dressed patrons giving way to flickering lights and hunched figures in dark cloaks. He was entering the seedy underbelly of Zeta Station now, a place where the Orion Syndicate and all sorts of galactic lowlifes congregated to drink, deal, and plot. The bar he sought was a grimy little hole in the wall, filled with green smoke from bubbling hookahs and smelling of cheap alcohol. Scarl was hunched over a glowing blue drink in a corner booth. George dropped down into the seat across from him and slid a credit chip across the sticky table. "I need information on a bioweapon, a virus that targets multiple species." Scarl's eyes narrowed as he palmed the chip and made it disappear. He leaned forward, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. "I might know something about that, but it'll cost you more than just credits, human." George frowned. Dealing with a scumbag like Scarl left a bad taste in his mouth, but billions of lives were at stake. "What do you want?" The reptilian gave a toothy grin. "A favor. I need access to the station's secure research lab. You're a respected scientist. You can get me in." George hesitated. What Scar was asking could get him arrested or worse. But if he didn't find out more about this virus, an unfathomable number could die. "Fine," he said through clenched teeth. "But first, tell me what you know." Scar nodded, satisfied. The virus was created by a rogue Benzite scientist named Dr. Zolak. He was working on a secret project funded by a faction within the Benzite government, a faction that opposed the Galactic Council's peace treaty with you humans. They wanted a weapon to wipe you out, level the playing field. George's blood ran cold. This was even worse than he thought. "Where can I find this Dr. Zolak?" "Last I heard, he was hiding out in the Tartarus sector, a lawless region on the edge of Benzite space, but watch yourself. He's got mercenaries protecting him." A lawless region of space, a mad scientist, bloodthirsty mercenaries. George knew the odds would be stacked against him, but this was the only lead he had. He stood up, muscles coiled with tension. "I'll deal with that when the time comes. For now, let's get you into that lab." The unlikely pair exited the bar, the fate of the galaxy depending on their shaky alliance. George and Scarl approached the secure research lab, the humans' credentials, granting them access past the armed guards and security scanners. Scarl's eyes darted around the sleek high-tech facility as they made their way to a secluded terminal. "Keep an eye out while I work," Scarl hissed, his clawed fingers already flying across the holographic interface. George nodded, his hand resting on the grip of the plasma pistol concealed beneath his jacket. His heart pounded as he scanned the lab, watching for any sign of trouble. Sweat beaded on his brow as the seconds ticked by, each moment increasing the risk of detection. George tensed as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor. "Hurry up, we've got company." The doors to the lab burst open, revealing a squad of heavily armed security drones, their metallic bodies glinting under the harsh lights. Just as they raised their weapons, Scarl yanked a data drive from the console. George and Scarl bolted for the emergency exit, plasma bolts sizzling past them as the drones opened fire. The acrid smell of burnt metal filled the air as they ducked and weaved, the exit seeming impossibly far away. With a final burst of speed, they lunged through the door, slamming it shut behind them. They found themselves in a dimly lit maintenance tunnel, the sounds of pursuit fading as they fled deeper into the station's bowels. Finally, they collapsed against a wall, chests heaving as they caught their breath. Scarl pulled out the data drive, holding it up with a triumphant grin. "Here's what I found. Dr. Zolak's research, his last known location, and a list of his benzite backers." George took the drive, his mind racing with the implications. "I need to get this to Spiker and the Galactic Council. They need to know how deep this conspiracy goes." Scarl nodded, his reptilian eyes narrowing. "What about our deal? I held up my end." The human and the reptilian locked eyes for a moment, an understanding passing between them. Then, without another word, they parted ways, each disappearing into the labyrinthine depths of Zeta Station. George clutched the data drive tightly, knowing that the fate of the galaxy now rested in his hands. The secrets it contained could unravel the sinister plot behind the Doomsday virus, but only if he could stay alive long enough to deliver it. George's fingers trembled slightly as he slid the data drive across the sleek black table. The secure room deep within Zeta Station hummed with tension as Speaker and Ambassador Zorlon leaned forward, their alien eyes locked on the small device. "This is it," George said, his voice low and urgent. "Dr. Zolak's research on the virus. It targets a specific genetic sequence found in most sapient species." He paused, meeting their gazes. "But there's a catch. Humans don't have this sequence. We're immune." Speaker's scales rippled as he exchanged a concerned glance with Zorlon. If the benzite faction behind this virus realizes that humans are immune, they might see it as an opportunity, a chance to weaken the other races and seize power. Zorlon's pale blue skin seemed to glow in the dim light as he spoke. "The Galactic Council will dispatch a team of peacekeepers to assist you, George. But we must act quickly and discreetly. We can't risk tipping off the benzite faction." "I'll head to the Tartarus sector," George said, his jaw set with determination. "I'll track down Dr. Zolak. With the peacekeepers' help, we should be able to apprehend him and secure the virus." Spiker stood, his reptilian eyes boring into George's. "Be careful, George. If the benzite faction discovers your mission, they won't hesitate to eliminate you." George met his gaze unflinchingly. "I understand the risks, but we can't let this virus fall into the wrong hands. The fate of the galaxy depends on it." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their task hanging heavy in the air. Then, with a final nod, George turned and strode out of the room, his boots echoing on the metal floor. Back in his quarters, George moved with practiced efficiency, gathering the equipment he would need for his mission. He checked the charge on his plasma pistol, the weapon humming to life in his hand. He packed extra power cells, a med kit, and a few days' worth of rations into a sturdy backpack. As he prepared to leave, George's thoughts turned to the countless lives at stake, the trillions of souls across the galaxy who were counting on him, whether they knew it or not. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. With a final glance around his room, George shouldered his backpack and set off towards the hangar bay. Speaker and Zorlon were waiting for him, their expressions somber as they bid him farewell. "Good luck, George," Speaker said, clasping his hand firmly. "The fate of the galaxy is in your hands." He turned to board his waiting ship, the sleek vessel gleaming under the hangar lights. As the airlock hissed shut behind him and the engines roared to life, George knew there was no turning back. He was embarking on a mission that would decide the fate of life itself, a lone human setting out to save the galaxy, from the brink of extinction. The ship lifted off, bursting forth from the hangar and into the star-strewn void of space. George plotted a course for the Tartarus sector, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Somewhere out there, amidst the lawless expanse of the galaxy's fringe, Dr. Zolak awaited with his Doomsday virus, and George would stop at nothing to find him. George's ship hurtled through the Tartarus sector, weaving between asteroids and derelict spacecraft. The sleek peacekeeper vessel cut through the void, its engines humming with power. Inside, George sat strapped into his seat, surrounded by a diverse squad of alien soldiers, the best the Galactic Council had to offer. Commander Krull, a hulking, four-armed warrior from a high-gravity world, loomed over the holographic tactical display. His eyes narrowed as they approached their target, a desolate asteroid base, Dr. Zolak's last known hideout. Suddenly alarms blared through the ship. The view screen filled with a swarm of unmanned fighter drones, their angular silhouettes darting towards the peacekeeper vessel. "Evasive action," Krull roared. The ship banked hard, narrowly avoiding a barrage of plasma fire. George gripped his harness, his knuckles white. "They knew we were coming. Dr. Zolak must have been tipped off." "Activate the point defense turrets," Krull barked. "Launch countermeasures." The peacekeeper ship returned fire, its laser cannons tracing glowing lines through the void. Drones exploded under the onslaught, but more swarmed in to take their place. George watched the battle unfold on the view screen, his mind racing. The drones moved with eerie coordination, their formations shifting in response to the peacekeeper ship's every move. Suddenly it clicked. "Commander Krull," George called out, "the drones are being controlled from a central hub. If we can locate and destroy it, we can disable them all at once." Krull's eyes scanned the tactical display, the holographic asteroids casting a ghostly blue glow over his craggy features. "There," he growled, stabbing a finger at the display. "A large asteroid at the edge of the field. It's heavily shielded, and the drones seem to be protecting it." George unbuckled his harness and pushed his way to the weapons console, shouldering aside the startled peacekeeper, manning the station. "Get us close, Commander. I'll take the shot." Krull hesitated for a split second, then nodded. "You heard the man. Full power to engines and forward shields." The peacekeeper ship surged forward, plunging into the heart of the drone swarm. The hull groaned as the drone's weapons hammered against the shields, the energy barrier flickering under the onslaught. George's hands flew over the console, his eyes locked on the targeting display. The asteroid loomed before them, its surface pitted and scarred. A shimmering energy field encased it, protecting the vital control hub within. With a deep breath, George stabbed the firing controls. A volley of quantum torpedoes leapt from the ship's launchers, streaking towards the asteroid. The projectiles detonated against the energy shield, the force of the blasts causing it to flicker and fail. George fired again, the second volley slamming into the asteroid's surface. A blinding explosion bloomed in the void, the shockwave buffeting the peacekeeper ship. As the glare faded, George saw the drones drifting aimlessly, their controls severed. A ragged cheer erupted from the peacekeeper crew. George slumped back in his seat, his heart pounding. Commander Krull clapped him on the shoulder, his alien face split in a fierce grin. "Nice shooting, Robertson. Now let's find Dr. Zolak and end this once and for all." The peacekeeper ship dove towards the asteroid base, its weapons primed and ready. George steeled himself for the confrontation to come, knowing that the fate of countless lives hung in the balance. The peacekeeper ship shuddered as it touched down on the asteroid's pitted surface. George checked his plasma rifle one last time as the landing ramp hissed open, revealing the yawning maw of the base's airlock. He took point, the strike team falling in behind him as they moved into the facility, weapons sweeping the dimly lit corridors. "Stay sharp," George whispered over the comm. "Zolak's mercs could be anywhere." They pushed deeper into the base, following the schematics gleaned from the destroyed drone hub. The only sound was the soft tread of their boots on the metal deck plates and the hum of power conduits running along the walls. Suddenly, a burst of plasma fire erupted from a side passage, searing the air where George's head had been a heartbeat before. He dove for cover, his team scattering as more shots filled the corridor. "Contact left," Kroll bellowed, his massive frame hunched behind a support beam. George risked a glance around the corner, catching a glimpse of the mercenaries. They were a ragtag bunch, a mix of races and species, but their weapons were top of the line. "Suppressing fire," George ordered, unleashing a barrage of plasma bolts down the passage. His team followed suit, the combined firepower forcing the mercs to take cover. "Flank them," Kroll roared, tossing a concussion grenade. The device detonated with a teeth-rattling boom, sending the mercs sprawling. George and two others seized the opening, rushing forward under the cover of smoke and dust. They vaulted over the dazed mercenaries, leaving them for Krull and the rest of the team to mop up. The door to the central lab loomed ahead, a massive blast door set into the asteroid rock. George placed a breaching charge, the magnetic clamps locking onto the metal with a heavy clunk. He primed the detonator and stepped back. The charge blew, shearing through the door's locking mechanism in a spray of molten metal. George kicked the door open, rifle up and ready. Dr. Zolak stood in the center of the lab, a small avian figure surrounded by banks of humming equipment. He turned to face them, a sinister smile spreading across his beaked face. "Ah, Mr. Robertson, I should have known you'd be the one to unravel my plans," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. George trained his weapon on the rogue scientist. "It's over, Zolak. Hand over the virus and come quietly." George's eyes widened in alarm. "You're insane. Millions will die." Dr. Zolak shrugged, unconcerned. "A necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the Benzite people. With the other races weakened, we will finally take our rightful place as the dominant species in the galaxy." George saw Zolak's hand twitch towards a concealed holster. Time seemed to slow as adrenaline surged through his veins. His finger tightened on the trigger, plasma bursting from the rifle's muzzle. The bolt caught Zolak square in the chest, burning through feather and flesh. The scientist crumpled, a look of shock etched on his avian features. George rushed to Zolak's side, pawing through his robes for any sign of the virus or its location. The scientist's breaths came in ragged gasps, blood bubbling from his beak. "You may have stopped me," Zolak whispered, his voice fading, "but you'll never stop the Benzite faction. They're too powerful, too well connected." George gritted his teeth, the weight of Zolak's words sinking in. The scope of the threat was far greater than he'd imagined. This wasn't just a rogue scientist. This was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Benzite power. George rose, turning to his team. They were already moving, securing the lab and gathering up data drives, samples, anything that might hold a clue to the virus's location. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. Somewhere out there, the Benzite faction was moving to unleash the deadliest weapon the galaxy had ever seen. And George would be damned if he let that happen. George burst into the conference room, his heart pounding. Speaker Ambassador Zorlan and the medical researchers turned to him, their faces etched with concern. He slapped a data chip onto the table. "We have a lead. The virus is being transported on a secret Benzite ship, the Shadowclaw. It's headed for the Orion sector, ETA, less than 12 hours. Dr. Rayner's ears perked up. The Orion sector. That's home to billions of innocent lives from dozens of species. George nodded grimly. "If the virus is released there, it'll be a massacre. We have to stop that ship." Spiker leaned forward. "How did you come by this information?" "A Benzite informant, high-ranking government official, disillusioned with the faction's plans, gave me the ship's coordinates and security codes." Zorlan frowned. "Can we trust this informant?" "No choice, it's the only lead we've got." George turned to Dr. Rayner. "Tell me you've made progress on a cure." The Vulpine scientist shook her head. "We're analyzing the virus's genetic structure, but it's complex. We need more time." George slammed his fist on the table. "Time is the one thing we don't have. We need to intercept that ship before it reaches the Orion sector." Speaker stood, his scales glinting under the harsh lights. "I'll scramble every peacekeeper ship in the quadrant. We'll hit the Shadowclaw with everything we've got." George shook his head. A frontal assault is too risky. If they realize we're onto them, they might panic and release the virus early. We need to infiltrate the ship, secure the virus, and neutralize it. Zorlan's brow furrowed. A stealth mission? That's a tall order, George. The Shadowclaw will be heavily guarded. I'll lead the mission myself. Assemble a small team, the best of the best. We'll slip aboard, neutralize any resistance, and secure the virus. Dr. Rayner stepped forward. I'm coming with you. You'll need someone who understands the virus, who can handle it safely. George started to protest, but the determination in Rayner's eyes stopped him. He nodded. All right, suit up and meet me in the hangar bay. We leave in 10. As the team dispersed to make preparations, George felt the weight of the mission settling on his shoulders. The fate of billions rested on their success. Failure was not an option. He strode from the room, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges to come. The Shadowclaw awaited, a sinister spectre bearing a cargo of death, and George would be there to meet it, to stare down the darkness and snatch victory from its jaws. The galaxy held its breath, unknowing as a lone human and his team set forth to stand against the oncoming storm. George's heart raced as the Peacekeeper ship hurtled through the void, rapidly closing in on the coordinates provided by the Benzite informant. The strike team gathered in the airlock, checking their weapons and armor, their faces grim with determination. George took his place at the front, his plasma pistol gripped tightly in his hand. As the ship pulled alongside the Shadowclaw, magnetic clamps locked onto its hull with a metallic clang. The airlock hissed open, revealing the dark interior of the Benzite vessel. George stepped forward, his boots ringing on the metal deck. Suddenly, a hail of plasma bolts erupted from the shadows, slamming into the Peacekeeper's energy shields. The Benzite faction's elite guards had been waiting for them, their weapons already trained on the airlock. George dove for cover, his pistol barking as he returned fire. The strike team spread out, taking up defensive positions and laying down suppressing fire. The air filled with the sizzle of plasma and the sharp tang of ozone. "Push forward," George shouted over the din of battle. "We need to reach the cargo hold." The Peacekeepers advanced, leapfrogging from cover to cover, their weapons spitting deadly energy. The Benzite guards fell back, but they fought fiercely, making the strike team pay for every inch of ground. George led the charge, his pistol flashing as he picked off guards with precise shots. His team followed close behind, their weapons blazing as they cut a path through the enemy ranks. Finally, they reached the reinforced doors of the cargo hold. George slapped a breaching charge on the lock, then took cover. The charge detonated with a thunderous boom, and the doors slid open, revealing the cavernous interior of the hold. As the smoke cleared, George and his team stepped inside, their weapons at the ready. What they saw made their blood run cold. Dozens of stasis pods lined the walls, each one containing a glowing vial of the Doomsday virus. The eerie green light cast sinister shadows across the room, and the hum of the pod's power systems filled the air. George tapped his comlink. "Dr. Rayner, we've secured the virus samples, but we need a way to neutralize them safely. Please tell me you've found something." Dr. Rayner's voice crackled over the link, filled with excitement. "George, we've had a breakthrough. We've discovered that the virus has a vulnerability to a specific wavelength of ultraviolet radiation. If you can expose the samples to a concentrated burst of this wavelength, it should render the virus inert." George turned to his team. "You heard the doctor. Find a UV emitter now." The Peacekeepers spread out, searching the Shadowclaw's inventory. They rummaged through crates and lockers, their movements urgent and purposeful. "Sir, over here," one of the soldiers called out. "I've found a high-powered industrial sterilization unit in the ship's medical bay." George rushed over, examining the device. It was a bulky, heavy-duty machine designed for sanitizing medical equipment. He nodded. "This will do. Let's get it rigged up." Working quickly, the team modified the sterilization unit, adjusting its settings to emit the precise wavelength needed to neutralize the virus. They wheeled it into the cargo hold, positioning it in front of the stasis pods. George took a deep breath, then activated the device. A bright purplish glow filled the room, bathing the virus samples in its eerie light. The team watched, their hearts pounding, as the seconds ticked by. A cheer went up from the strike team, their relief palpable. They had prevented a galactic catastrophe, stopping the Benzite faction's sinister plot in its tracks. As the team secured the neutralized virus samples and rounded up the Shadowclaw's crew, George felt a sense of grim satisfaction. They had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. The Benzite faction was still out there, their tentacles reaching deep into the galaxy's power structures. Bringing them to justice would be a long and difficult fight. But for now, George allowed himself a moment of relief. They had struck a blow against the darkness, and the galaxy was a little bit safer because of it. The Peacekeeper ship thundered into the bustling hangar bay of Zeta Station, the roar of its engines echoing off the metal walls. A crowd of dignitaries and well-wishers had gathered, their faces alight with excitement and anticipation. As the ship's ramp lowered, George and his team emerged, their expressions a mix of triumph and exhaustion. Ambassador Zorlon stepped forward, his pale blue skin glowing under the hangar lights. "Commander Robertson, on behalf of the Galactic Council and all the peoples of the galaxy, I thank you and your team for your bravery and sacrifice. You have averted a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions." George nodded, his hand clasped firmly in the ambassador's. "We did what had to be done, sir, but the fight isn't over yet. The Benzite faction is still out there, and they won't rest until they've seen their twisted vision realized." The crowd parted as George and his team were led to a grand ceremonial hall, its walls adorned with the flags and emblems of 100 different worlds. They took their places on a raised dais, facing a sea of alien faces, each one filled with gratitude and respect. As the ceremony began, George found his mind wandering, his thoughts turning to the battles yet to come. He scanned the crowd, his eyes falling on Speaker, who stood at the edge of the room, his expression grim. The ceremony seemed to drag on for an eternity, a blur of speeches and accolades. George accepted each honor with a nod and a tight smile, his mind already racing ahead to the next challenge. Finally, the ceremony drew to a close, and the crowd began to disperse. George made his way through the throng of well-wishers, his eyes locked on Spiker. The reptilian beckoned him over, his voice low and urgent. "George, we have a problem, a big one." George's brow furrowed. "What is it?" "We've intercepted communications from the Benzite faction. They're planning to retaliate against the Galactic Council for the loss of the virus. They've amassed a fleet in the Sirius sector and are preparing to launch an all-out assault on the Council's headquarters. Soon, very soon. The Council's defenses won't stand a chance against a surprise attack of that magnitude." George nodded, his mind already racing. "Then we need to stop them before they can carry out their plan. We need to gather our allies and launch a preemptive strike against the Benzite fleet. It's the only way to ensure the safety of the Council and the stability of the galaxy." Speaker's eyes flashed with determination. "Agreed, I'll start making calls. The Peacekeepers, the Orion Syndicate, anyone who owes us a favor. We'll need all the help we can get." Over the next few hours, George and Spiker worked tirelessly, rallying their forces and coordinating their strategy. They pored over star maps and intelligence reports, identifying the Benzite fleet's weak points and supply lines. As the Allied fleet began to assemble in the Sirius sector, George found himself on the bridge of the USS Avenger, a sleek and powerful battle cruiser. He stood before the view screen, his hands clasped behind his back, as the stars streaked past. "Commander, we're approaching the Sirius sector," the helm officer reported, his voice tense. George nodded, his eyes fixed on the view screen. "Bring us out of warp. Raise shields and charge weapons." The Avenger dropped out of warp, the inky blackness of space giving way to a sea of glittering stars, and there, hanging in the void like a swarm of angry hornets, was the Benzite fleet. George's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight before him. Dozens of ships, each one bristling with weapons and armor. They outnumbered the Allied fleet 2-1, their formation tight and disciplined. But George knew that numbers alone didn't win battles. He had faith in his crew, in his allies, and in the righteousness of their cause. He leaned forward, his voice steady and resolute as he gave the order. "All ships, this is Commander Robertson. Commence attack. Let's show the Benzite faction what happens when they threaten the peace and unity of the galaxy." The bridge erupted into a flurry of activity as the crew rushed to carry out his orders. The Avenger surged forward, its weapons glowing hot as it prepared to unleash hell on the enemy. All around them, the Allied fleet followed suit, their ships forming up into attack formations as they raced towards the Benzite lines. The distance between the two fleets vanished in a heartbeat, and then the void erupted into a maelstrom of fire and light. The battle for the fate of the galaxy had begun. The void of space erupted into a kaleidoscope of destruction as the Allied fleet clashed with the Benzite armada. The USS Avenger shuddered under the onslaught of plasma fire, its shields flickering dangerously. On the bridge, George gripped the armrests of his command chair, his eyes darting across the tactical display. The crew scrambled to obey, their fingers flying across consoles as the ship returned fire. Explosions bloomed in the darkness, the Benzite ships buckling under the assault. But for every ship they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. George's jaw tightened as he watched the casualty reports scrolling across the screen. They were losing too many ships, too many lives. He needed to end this, and fast. His eyes locked onto the massive Benzite dreadnought at the heart of the enemy fleet. Its plasma cannons were tearing through the Allied ships like paper, its shields shrugging off their attacks. "That dreadnought is the key," George said, his voice low and determined. "If we take it out, we can cripple their fleet." He turned to his first officer, a tall insectoid alien named Zrix. "Assemble a boarding party. We're going to infiltrate that ship and sabotage its reactor core." Zrix's compound eyes widened. "Sir, that's a suicide mission. The dreadnought's defenses are too strong." George stood, his gaze hardening. "I'll lead the mission myself. I won't ask my crew to take a risk I'm not willing to take myself." The bridge fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Finally, Zrix nodded. "Understood, sir. I'll have a team ready in 5 minutes." George strode from the bridge, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew the odds were against them, but he also knew that this was their only chance to turn the tide of the battle. Minutes later, George and his team stood in the Avengers' hangar bay checking their weapons and armor. They were a diverse group, humans and aliens united in their resolve. George met each of their gazes in turn, seeing the same determination reflected back at him. "We all know what's at stake here," he said, his voice steady. "The fate of the galaxy rests on our shoulders. We cannot fail." With a final nod, they boarded a small, stealthy shuttle and launched into the chaos of the battle. George piloted the craft with expert precision, weaving through the crossfire and debris as they approached the dreadnought. The interior of the dreadnought was a maze of dimly lit corridors and cavernous chambers. The team moved swiftly and silently, taking out Benzite guards with precise shots and hand-to-hand combat. As they fought their way deeper into the ship, a sense of unease grew in George's gut. Something wasn't right. The defenses were too light, the resistance too weak. It was almost as if they were being allowed to reach their target. The truth hit him like a punch to the throat as they burst into the dreadnought's command center. There, waiting for them with a sinister smile on his reptilian face, stood Zargon, the ruthless warlord of the Benzite faction. George leveled his plasma rifle at the warlord, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's over, Zargon. Surrender now, and your life may be spared." Zargon laughed, a cruel grating sound. "Surrender? To a pathetic human like you? Never!" He stepped forward, his eyes glinting with madness. "You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, don't you? You think you're the hero here to save the galaxy from the big, bad Benzites?" George's brow furrowed, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. "What are you talking about?" Zargon spread his arms wide, a mocking gesture. "I'm talking about the truth, George. The truth that I orchestrated everything, The Doomsday virus, the war against the Galactic Council, all of it. I played you all like puppets on a string. George's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. The mysterious informant, the security codes, the weakened defenses. It had all been a trap, a ploy to lure him and the Allied fleet into a final, devastating confrontation. "You monster!" George snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You won't get away with this." Zargon's smile widened, his teeth glinting in the harsh light. "Oh, but I already have. You see, while you were busy fighting your way here, my agents were planting bombs in the reactor cores of every ship in your fleet. In a matter of minutes, they'll detonate and your precious alliance will be nothing but dust and debris." George's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing. He had to warn the fleet, had to stop the bombs, but Zargon stood between him and the command console, a formidable obstacle. "You'll have to go through me first," Zargon hissed, dropping into a combat stance. The two warriors clashed in a blur of fists and feet, their movements a deadly dance of skill and strength. George ducked and weaved, his human agility a match for Zargon's reptilian speed. They traded blows, each impact sending shockwaves through the command center. With a final desperate lunge, George tackled Zargon, sending them both tumbling over the edge of the command platform. They plummeted down towards the pulsing heart of the Dreadnought's reactor core. George closed his eyes, a sense of calm washing over him. He knew what he had to do, knew the sacrifice he had to make. As they fell, he wrapped his arms around Zargon, locking the warlord in an unbreakable embrace. Zargon struggled, his claws tearing at George's flesh, but it was too late. They hit the reactor core with a blinding flash of light, the impact sending shockwaves through the ship. The core destabilized, the containment fields failing one by one. In his final moments, George thought of his crew, his allies, and the countless lives he had fought to protect. He thought of the galaxy he had given everything to save. And as the reactor exploded, consuming the Dreadnought in a fiery inferno, George Robertson knew that his sacrifice had not been in vain. The Allied fleet, seizing the opportunity, surged forward, their weapons tearing through the disorganized Benzite ranks. Without their flagship and their leader, the enemy ships fell one by one, until finally the last of them surrendered. The galaxy had been saved, but the cost had been high. As the ships limped back to Zeta Station, the weight of their losses hung heavy in the air. In the days that followed, a somber ceremony was held to honor the fallen. Speaker, Ambassador Zorlon, and the other allies gathered to pay their respects, their faces etched with grief and gratitude. They spoke of George Robertson, the human who had given his life to save them all. They spoke of his courage, his determination, and his unwavering belief in the power of unity. And as they laid a wreath at the base of a memorial statue, they made a solemn vow. They would honor George's sacrifice by maintaining the peace and unity he had fought for. They would build a galaxy where all species could live and thrive together, free from the threat of war and destruction. It would not be an easy task, they knew. The scars of the conflict ran deep, and the memories of the fallen would never fade. But as they looked out at the stars, they knew that they had to try. For George Robertson, for the galaxy he had saved, and for the future he had given them all. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.